17 degrees below zero. That was the temperature when the rotting timber of the hunting cabin finally stopped holding back the frost. Caleb pulled his shivering 8-year-old sister closer, wrapping his arms and their golden retriever around her small frame. He knew if they fell asleep tonight, they wouldn't wake up. The breaking point didn't happen with a cinematic explosion. It started with a knocked-over bowl of cheap soup. It was a bleak Tuesday evening in late October. 16-year-old Caleb Bennett stood in the cramped, linoleum-floored kitchen of a decaying rental house on Elmira Street, located in the dreary outskirts of Spokane, Washington. He was carefully stirring a pot of powdered macaroni and cheese, the only meal he could scrape together for his 8-year-old sister, Lily. Their mother, Caroline, was working her usual double shift at a truck stop diner out on Interstate 90, leaving Caleb to manage the household and, more dangerously, to manage their stepfather, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a large, bitterly resentful man who had lost his job at the local lumber mill 3 years prior and had since made a full-time occupation out of drinking cheap beer and watching television in a stained recliner. He ruled the small house with volatile unpredictability. The only buffering force between Arthur's rage and Lily was Caleb. And then there was Buster, a 3-year-old golden retriever mix with more heart than situational awareness, who belonged to the children and whom Arthur despised. The house was suffocatingly quiet, save for the low hum of the television in the living room. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing quietly with a broken purple crayon. Buster was pacing, his tail wagging as he caught the scent of the cooking pasta. In his excitement, the dog bumped into a small TV tray, holding Arthur's half-eaten bowl of leftover chicken noodle soup, sending it crashing onto the faux hardwood floor. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed like a gunshot. Arthur lunged out of his recliner, his face flushed a dangerous mottled red. "You useless mutt!" he roared, kicking out blindly. Buster yelped, scrambling backward on the slick floor. Caleb didn't think. He simply reacted. He dropped the wooden spoon and shoved himself between the heavy man and the cowering dog. "Don't touch him, Arthur! It was an accident!" "Accident?" Arthur spat, grabbing Caleb by the front of his faded flannel shirt. The smell of stale malt liquor and stale tobacco was overwhelming. "I'm sick of you. I'm sick of the brat, and I'm sick of this dog eating my food in my house." With a violent shove, Arthur threw the teenager backward. Caleb slammed into the front door. Before he could regain his footing, Arthur twisted the deadbolt, wrenched the door open, and hurled Caleb out onto the concrete porch. The cold, relentless autumn rain of the Pacific Northwest was falling in sheets. "Don't come back, you ungrateful parasite!" Arthur screamed, slamming the door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. Caleb stood in the freezing rain, water instantly soaking through his clothes. He pounded on the door, his knuckles bruising against the cheap wood. But the only response was the volume of the television turning up. Panic clawed at his throat. He was outside, but Lily and Buster were still in there. He knew Arthur wouldn't physically hurt Lily. He needed her presence to claim the monthly survivor benefits from Caleb and Lily's deceased biological father. But leaving her alone in that environment was unthinkable. Caleb retreated to the detached, drafty garage at the end of the driveway. He sat on an overturned bucket in the dark, shivering violently, waiting. He watched the living room window. 1 hour passed, then 2. The rain turned into a heavy, freezing drizzle. Finally, around 1 a.m., the blue light of the television flickered off, and the house went dark. Moving with practiced silence, Caleb crept to the back of the house. The latch on the laundry room window had been broken for months, a defect he had intentionally hidden from Arthur. He wedged his fingers under the frame, lifted the sash, and shimmied inside, landing softly on a pile of damp towels. He crept down the hallway to the small bedroom Lily occupied. She was awake, huddled under a thin quilt, her eyes wide with terror in the dark. Buster was pressed firmly against her side. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm here, Bug," he whispered back, kneeling beside her bed. "We have to go. Right now." "Where are we going?" "On a camping trip," he lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just you, me, and Buster. But you have to be quieter than a mouse." Caleb moved frantically. He grabbed his canvas duffel bag and stuffed it with every piece of warm clothing Lily owned: thermal socks, oversized sweaters, and her winter coat. He packed his own meager belongings, a heavy wool blanket, a flashlight with dying D batteries, and 3 cans of beef stew from the pantry. Before leaving, he made one final stop. He sneaked back into the garage and reached into the rafters. He knew Arthur kept an emergency stash of cash hidden in an old Folgers coffee can. Caleb pulled it down, his cold fingers fumbling with the plastic lid. $340. It felt like a fortune, and at that moment, it was their only lifeline. He didn't consider calling the police or Child Protective Services. In Caleb's mind, the system was a machine that would strip them apart. They would put Lily in foster care, take Buster to a shelter where he'd likely be put down, and stick Caleb in a group home. He had promised their late father, David, that he would always protect his little sister. Running was the only way to keep that promise. With the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, Lily's small hand gripped tightly in his, and Buster walking silently by their side, Caleb stepped off the porch of the Elmira Street house for the last time. They disappeared into the freezing, rain-slicked night, heading north toward the towering, imposing silhouette of the Selkirk Mountains. The trek was agonizing. They walked for hours along the dark shoulders of County Road 9, dodging the occasional headlights of passing logging trucks by diving into the wet ditch. Lily was exhausted, her small legs unable to keep up the pace. For the last 3 miles, Caleb carried her on his back, his muscles burning, the straps of the heavy duffel bag biting deep into his shoulders. As dawn broke, painting the overcast sky in bruised shades of grey and purple, they finally veered off the paved road and onto an overgrown logging trail. Caleb was navigating entirely by memory. Years ago, before his biological father died of a sudden heart attack, David Bennett used to take Caleb hunting up in these dense woods. There was an old, abandoned line cabin off Ridge 114, a relic from the 1970s logging booms. Caleb prayed it was still standing. By noon, the trio broke through a thick thicket of cedar trees, and Caleb let out a ragged breath of relief. The cabin was there. It was small, roughly 15 by 20 feet, constructed of thick, rough-hewn pine logs. It looked miserable. The front porch had partially collapsed, and moss grew thick over the western-facing walls. But the roof, though sagging in the middle, appeared largely intact. "Is this it?" Lily asked, sliding off Caleb's back and staring skeptically at the dilapidated structure. "It's a fixer-upper," Caleb said, forcing a reassuring smile. "But it's ours for now." The interior smelled intensely of damp earth, mildew, and ancient pine needles. The floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. However, sitting in the corner was their saving grace: a heavy, rust-covered cast-iron wood stove, complete with a tin pipe that vented out through the roof. Caleb immediately went to work. The survival of his sister depended entirely on his ability to make this wooden box habitable. He spent the first 48 hours in a blur of frantic labor. Using a rusted shovel he found leaning against the back of the cabin, he cleared out years of accumulated debris and animal droppings. He patched a broken window using heavy-duty garbage bags and duct tape he had packed. He gathered fallen deadwood, snapping branches over his knee until his hands were raw and splintered, building a massive pile of fuel against the interior wall to keep it dry. When he finally managed to get a fire going in the cast-iron stove, the radiant heat felt like a miracle. Lily sat in front of it, wrapped in the wool blanket, while Buster curled up at her feet, letting out a long, contented sigh. For a fleeting moment, as the orange firelight danced across the rough log walls, Caleb felt a profound sense of triumph. He had done it. He had gotten them out. The first 3 weeks of November brought a deceptive peace. The weather was crisp but manageable, hovering in the low 40s during the day. Caleb established a strict routine to maintain a sense of normalcy for Lily. He acted as her teacher, using a stolen notebook to practice math and spelling. They played endless games of hangman and told stories. To sustain them, Caleb had to venture down the mountain once a week to Miller's Outpost, a small, dusty junction, store gas station, run by a perpetually frowning man named Hank Jenkins. Caleb would hike the grueling 6 miles down, buy bulk rice, dried beans, cheap peanut butter, and D batteries using Arthur's stolen money. He carefully maintained a cover story, telling Hank he was camping up at the state park with his dad. But the illusion of safety began to fracture in the 4th week. During one of his trips to the outpost, Caleb was counting out crumpled dollar bills on the counter when Hank narrowed his eyes, wiping a greasy rag across the register. "You know, kid," Hank rasped, his gravelly voice cutting through the hum of the store's refrigerator units. "Sheriff's deputies were in here 2 days ago, asking if anyone had seen a teenager and a little girl. Said they ran off from a bad situation down in Spokane. Stepdad claims they stole from him and vanished. He's raising holy hell, demanding the state track you down." Caleb's blood ran cold. He forced his hand to remain steady as he pocketed his change. Arthur wasn't looking for them out of love. He was looking for them to avoid a police investigation into his own abuse and to secure the monthly checks attached to Lily's name. If they were caught, Arthur would spin a web of lies, paint Caleb as a delinquent kidnapper, and reclaim Lily. "Haven't seen anyone like that, sir," Caleb lied smoothly, grabbing his plastic bags. "I'll tell my dad to keep an eye out, though." He practically ran the 6 miles back up the mountain, panic giving him unnatural endurance. They were truly trapped now. Going back to civilization meant losing Lily forever. They had to stay hidden. But nature had its own brutal plans. By late November, the environment began to shift with alarming speed. The birds had vanished. The deer and smaller game Caleb had occasionally seen in the woods seemed to have evacuated the ridge entirely. An eerie, suffocating silence settled over the Selkirk Mountains. Caleb had purchased a cheap, battery-powered transistor radio from Hank, hoping to catch local news. On November 28th, the static broke, and an emergency broadcast cut through the tinny speaker. The voice of the meteorologist was tight with genuine concern. A massive polar vortex was dropping down from Canada, colliding with a heavy moisture front from the Pacific. The region wasn't just facing a snowstorm, they were facing a historic, life-threatening blizzard. Temperatures were expected to plummet well below zero, accompanied by feet of snow and hurricane-force winds. Caleb stood on the sagging porch of the cabin, staring up through the canopy of cedar trees. The sky wasn't just grey anymore. It was an angry, bruised purple. The air pressure had dropped so significantly, he could feel a dull ache behind his eyes. A single, massive snowflake drifted down, landing on the sleeve of his flannel shirt. It didn't melt. He looked at the cabin, the thin, garbage bag-patched window, the gaps between the ancient logs where the wind already whistled, and the woodpile that suddenly looked terrifyingly small. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had protected his sister from a monster in a recliner, only to drag her into the path of a monster they couldn't run from. Old Man Winter had arrived, and he was coming to collect. The blizzard hit on the evening of November 29th, not with a roar, but with a terrifying, suffocating hiss. A wall of blinding white swallowed Ridge 114, erasing the cedar trees, the dilapidated porch, and the sky. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing at the loose shingles of the cabin and forcing icy drafts through every microscopic crack in the ancient log walls. Within hours, the temperature plummeted past 0. Caleb's meager preparations felt laughably inadequate against the sheer violence of the storm. He spent the first night feeding the cast-iron stove with an agonizingly slow rhythm, rationing the dry wood he had painstakingly gathered. By the third day of the whiteout, the woodpile was gone. Caleb resorted to breaking down the cabin's rotting interior. He used a heavy rock to smash an old, splintered wooden bed frame, feeding the dry, dusty pieces into the hungry flames. When that was gone, he tore up the loose floorboards from the far corner of the room. But the old wood burned too fast, offering a bright, desperate flare of heat before collapsing into useless grey ash. On the fourth night, the storm reached its zenith. 17 degrees below 0. That was the temperature when the rotting timber of the hunting cabin finally stopped holding back the frost. Caleb pulled his shivering 8-year-old sister closer, wrapping his arms and their golden retriever, Buster, around her small frame. Lily's breathing was shallow and ragged. A deep, concerning cough had settled in her chest over the last 24 hours. Her forehead was alarmingly hot against his cheek, a stark contrast to the freezing air. He knew if they fell asleep tonight, they wouldn't wake up. Suddenly, Buster's head snapped up. The golden retriever let out a low, vibrating growl, the fur along his spine standing on end. Caleb froze. The wind was deafening, but beneath the howling gale there was a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the front of the cabin. It wasn't the rhythmic banging of a loose shutter. It was deliberate. It was heavy. Caleb gently untangled himself from Lily and grabbed the thickest, heaviest piece of floorboard he had left. He stood in front of his sister, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The front door groaned under a massive weight. Then, with a violent splintering of dry, rotted wood, the latch gave way. The door slammed inward, letting in a blinding swirl of snow and agonizingly cold wind. A massive, snow-caked figure collapsed across the threshold, falling face-first onto the dusty floorboards. It was Arthur Pendleton. Caleb stood paralyzed, his makeshift weapon raised. Arthur was a horrifying sight. His heavy winter coat was torn, his lips were a bruised, oxygen-deprived blue, and his eyebrows and eyelashes were thick with solid ice. He was shivering so violently that his teeth audibly clacked together, a sickening sound in the quiet terror of the room. Arthur had found them. Driven by a toxic cocktail of panic, rage, and the desperate need to secure the survivor benefit checks before the police dug too deep into his life, Arthur had intimidated the local store owner, Hank. After getting a rough location, Arthur had stolen a neighbor's 4x4 truck, intending to drag the kids back by force. But the mountain didn't care about Arthur's ego or his rage. His truck had slid into a ditch 2 miles down the logging road, forcing the out-of-shape, heavily intoxicated man to hike through waist-deep snow in the middle of a historic blizzard. Nature had broken him. The man who had terrorized Caleb for years was now a pathetic, whimpering heap on the floor, entering the late, lethal stages of hypothermia. "Caleb?" Lily whimpered from the blankets, shrinking back against the wall. Caleb looked at the man who had thrown him into the freezing rain. A dark, intrusive thought crossed Caleb's mind. If I just push him back outside and barricade the door, it's over. We are free. The mountain would do what Caleb could not. It would erase the monster. Arthur groaned, a weak, wet sound, and tried to reach out a frost-bitten, ungloved hand toward the dying warmth of the stove. Caleb lowered the piece of wood. He looked back at Lily, whose wide, terrified eyes were locked onto him. He realized in that split second that if he let Arthur die, he would be letting the darkness of the man infect him. His father, David Bennett, had raised a protector, not a killer. "It's going to be okay, Bug," Caleb said, his voice hard but steady. Caleb sprang into action. He dragged Arthur's dead weight fully into the cabin and forced the broken door shut, bracing it with an overturned, rusted barrel. He stripped off Arthur's frozen, snow-packed outer layers. He used the very last of their emergency firewood, a thick cedar log he had been saving as an absolute last resort, and shoved it into the stove. He took his own heavy winter coat and laid it over his abuser. Caleb sat awake for the rest of the night, watching the dying embers cast long, trembling shadows over the walls, guarding his sister from the man sleeping inches away, waiting for the dawn or death to take them. When morning broke on the 5th day, the wind had finally died. A heavy, oppressive silence replaced the howling storm. The sunlight filtering through the garbage bag window was painfully bright, reflecting off 4 feet of fresh snow. The fire was completely dead. The cold inside the cabin was absolute. Arthur lay entirely unresponsive, locked in a deep, hypothermic coma. Lily was barely conscious, her lips dangerously pale, her body limp against Buster. Caleb knew with terrifying certainty that they had less than a few hours left. "Stay with her, Buster," Caleb croaked, his throat raw. He kissed Lily's burning forehead. "I'm going to get help, I promise." Caleb wrapped a wool blanket around his waist, tied his boots as tight as his numb fingers would allow, and pushed open the damaged door. The world outside was an unrecognizable, glittering wasteland. Every landmark was gone. Caleb began to march. The snow was up to his waist, making every step an exhausting, full-body battle. He didn't know where he was going. He just aimed downhill. After an hour, his legs stopped obeying him. The freezing air burned his lungs. He stumbled, falling face-first into a snowdrift. He tried to push himself up, but his arms felt like lead. The urge to simply close his eyes, to let the warm, deceptive numbness of the cold take over, was overwhelming. Thwop, thwop, thwop. The sound was distant at first, cutting through the ringing in his ears. It grew louder, accompanied by the distinct roar of heavy machinery. Caleb forced his head up. Cresting the ridge, throwing massive plumes of white powder into the air, were 2 Spokane County search and rescue snowmobiles. Sheriff Brody Davis, a veteran of mountain rescues, cut the engine and leaped off his machine, rushing toward the half-buried teenager. "Kid, hey, stay with me!" Sheriff Davis yelled, pulling Caleb out of the drift. "Are you Caleb Bennett?" "My sister," Caleb wheezed, grabbing the sheriff's neon jacket with claw-like, frost-bitten fingers. "Up the ridge, the old logging cabin. She's sick. Please." "We've got you, son," the sheriff said, signaling frantically to his partner. The twist of fate, the dark irony of the entire ordeal, became apparent an hour later. Sheriff Davis and his team hadn't found Caleb by randomly sweeping the millions of acres of the Selkirk Mountains. They had found him because, an hour earlier, they had stumbled upon Arthur Pendleton's stolen, partially buried, 4x4 truck blocking the main logging artery. Arthur, in his malicious attempt to hunt them down, had inadvertently left a massive, undeniable breadcrumb trail leading right to Ridge 114. His greed had become their literal beacon in the snow. The rescue was a blur of thermal blankets, flashing lights, and the roaring heaters of an ambulance at the base of the mountain. Search and rescue medics stabilized Lily, treated Buster for mild frost nip, and loaded a comatose Arthur into a medevac helicopter. 3 days later, Caleb sat in a sterile, brightly lit room at Sacred Heart Medical Center. The steady hum of the hospital was a jarring contrast to the silence of the woods. His hands were heavily bandaged, recovering from second-degree frostbite. The door opened, and a woman with kind eyes and a stern posture walked in. It was Detective Sarah Mitchell. "How's Lily?" Caleb asked immediately. "She's going to be just fine, Caleb. The antibiotics knocked out the pneumonia. Buster is eating the nurses out of house and home in the animal ward." Detective Mitchell smiled, sitting at the foot of his bed. Her expression then shifted to something much more serious. "Arthur woke up this morning," she said quietly. "He immediately started screaming that you kidnapped Lily, that you stole his money, and that you left him to die in the snow." Caleb's heart dropped. The nightmare wasn't over. Arthur was going to spin his web. "But here's the thing about the cold, Caleb," Detective Mitchell continued, her voice hardening. "It preserves the truth. We found your bruising from where he threw you out. We have Hank Jenkins on record stating Arthur threatened him to find your location. We have the stolen truck, and the medics confirmed that when they found Arthur in that cabin, he was wrapped in your winter coat, next to a stove you kept burning to save his life." She leaned forward, placing a warm hand over his bandaged ones. "Winter proved you right, Caleb. It stripped away all his lies. It showed us exactly what kind of monster he is, and exactly what kind of man you are. Arthur Pendleton is facing multiple felony charges, including severe child endangerment and grand theft auto. He's going away for a very long time." Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled over Caleb's cheeks. The invisible weight he had carried since his father died, the constant fear, the hypervigilance, the terror of the system, finally shattered. 2 months later, the system that Caleb had so desperately feared proved to be their salvation. Because of the undeniable evidence of his devotion and maturity, the state expedited a unique foster arrangement. Caleb and Lily were placed together with Tom and Martha Montgomery, an older retired couple who owned a small apple orchard on the sunny side of the valley. On a bright Tuesday in March, Caleb stood on the back porch of the Montgomery home. The snow had finally melted, replaced by the vibrant green of early spring. Lily was laughing in the yard, throwing a battered tennis ball for Buster, who bounded after it with clumsy enthusiasm. Caleb took a deep breath of the crisp, clean air, knowing for the first time in his life that when the sun set tonight, they would be safe. The ordeal on Ridge 114 stripped away every illusion. The brutal winter didn't just test Caleb's endurance, it exposed Arthur's profound cruelty to the world. Today, Caleb and Lily thrive with the Montgomery family, their bond unbroken. Sometimes it takes the coldest, darkest storms to reveal the unyielding strength of human love and the undeniable truth of who we really are. The ice melted, but their resilience remained.